A man laughs too loud at the wrong table, calling Harlem finished. Someone mutters Bumpy Johnson's name like a warning. Hands drift toward coats. Violence is expected, yet the room waits because power arrives quieter than threats. Harlem could feel it before it happened. The air gets heavier, street noise turns careful, doors stay closed a little longer than usual. People lower their eyes as they pass, like the neighborhood itself is choosing to breathe slower. That night carried that same weight. Inside the back room, a laugh broke out sharp, careless, and wrong. Not a Harlem laugh, a disrespectful one. Too loud, too comfortable. And worst of all, in the wrong place. Outside, an old man on a stoop paused like he'd heard something shift. In a barbershop, a razor hovered a fraction longer over a man's cheek. In a kitchen, a woman let the water run, stocked it, then started it again. No reason except the feeling that something had tilted. In Harlem, disrespect travels. Inside, the man kept smiling, enjoying the attention. He spoke like the neighborhood was already tired, like its rules were outdated, like Harlem was finished. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a claim that the city's dignity no longer mattered. A few hands drifted toward coats, not even to draw, just to steady themselves. Because when a line is crossed like that, gunfire is what people expect. Harlem had seen too many nights where pride got answered with blood. But Bumpy Johnson didn't silence the laugh. He isolated it. Without raising his voice, without moving fast, he let the room understand what it had just heard. He let the disrespect sit alone in the air, unsupported until it started to feel dangerous to be near it. That was his correction. Not noise, but pressure. The laugh died on its own, slowly, awkwardly, like a man realizing too late he'd spoken in front of the wrong witnesses. And in the quiet that followed, Harlem remembered its real rule. Power doesn't arrive by shouting. Power arrives when a room waits and no one is given permission. Bumpy's answer was still coming, but the neighborhood already knew one thing for certain. This night wouldn't end quickly, and whatever lesson it carried would stay for a long time. Harlem didn't belong to whoever spoke the loudest. It belonged to whoever kept it standing. Outside the back room, the neighborhood moved with its usual patience. Storefront gates rattled up at dawn. A butcher rinsed his step like cleanliness could keep trouble away. Women crossed streets with practiced awareness, not fear, awareness. Children learned which corners were safe without anyone teaching them directly. Harlem educated you quietly. Bumpy Johnson walked through that world like he was part of its structure, not as decoration. As foundation, he didn't need to be announced because the evidence of him was everywhere, the calm that settled arguments before they became funerals, the order that kept reckless men from turning blocks into war zones. People respected him for a reason that couldn't be written down. He understood that a neighborhood survives on dignity. A man might tolerate hunger, might tolerate hard winters, might even tolerate police pressure. But disrespect, constant, public disrespect, rotted a place from the inside. It made men desperate. It made young ones reckless. It made decent people start believing chaos was normal. Bumpy didn't allow that. Not because he loved control for its own sake, because he knew what disorder cost. A shopkeeper who got shaken down too often stopped opening early. A mother who heard too many gunshots stopped letting her boy run errands. A church that had to bury too many men stopped believing in tomorrow. Harlem couldn't afford those losses, so Bumpy ran his world with rules that felt like restraint until you understood they were protection. He didn't reward noise. He rewarded discipline. Men who worked under him learned quickly. Don't start trouble in the open. Don't embarrass someone who hasn't earned it. Don't bring heat to a corner where families live. And if you made a mistake, you didn't plead. You corrected it before the neighborhood had to. That was the loyalty Harlem gave back. Not blind loyalty, practical loyalty. The kind built on outcomes. When people spoke his name, it wasn't worship. It was acknowledgement. Like saying the streetlights would come on. like saying the rules still mattered. And those rules weren't written on paper. They were written in pauses, in the way conversations lowered when certain subjects rose, in the way men checked themselves before letting pride speak, in the way disrespect, once it entered a room, was treated like smoke, something that spreads fast and ruins everything if you don't contain it. That's why the laugh from the night before felt so dangerous. It wasn't just an insult aimed at Bumpy, it was an insult aimed at Harlem's stability. And Harlem had a way of answering insults through the one man who didn't need to answer loudly at all. The pressure didn't arrive with guns. It arrived dressed well. A man in a clean suit could do more damage than a fool with a pistol, because a clean suit could walk into rooms that violence couldn't. It could shake hands, smile, talk business, then leave poison behind without anyone seeing the drop. That's how it started. Small things. Quiet things. A payment that took an extra day. A delivery routed the long way. A familiar face suddenly busy when a call went out. Nothing dramatic enough to justify a response, only enough to test whether Bumpy's calm had become softness. Men who wanted his position told themselves it had. They spoke in careful rooms over neat glasses, pretending they were only discussing the future. Harlem, they said, was changing. The old ways were slowing down. Respect was expensive now. It was easier to buy fear. They convinced themselves Bumpy's restraint was a weakness, because they didn't understand what restraint protected. The streets began to feel it first. A corner that used to run smooth grew tense. Men started watching each other instead of watching for outsiders. A store owner hesitated before extending credit. A bartender listened harder than he poured. The neighborhood wasn't panicking, but it was noticing. And notice was how trouble announced itself in Harlem. Bumpy didn't respond with noise. He responded with observation. He moved quietly through familiar places, barbershops, stoops, back entrances, looking at eyes, not mouths. He asked questions without sounding like questions. He let people speak until the truth stepped out on its own. And the truth was simple. Someone was trying to pull the city's respect away from him piece by piece. Not by challenging him directly, by making his order look unreliable. Because if Harlem started believing stability was fading, they'd accept a new hand on the wheel, not out of betrayal, but out of survival. That was the real play. They targeted loyalty. A young runner got offered better money to forget instructions. A small operator was encouraged to complain loud enough for others to hear. A man who owed Bumpy respect was tempted to delay it publicly just once to see if anyone would correct him. Each test was meant to make Bumpy chase them. But Bumpy didn't chase. He waited, because he knew pressure reveals character. The men applying it would eventually grow impatient. They'd push too far. They always did. That impatience was the only opening he needed. Then came the invitation. A meeting with too many witnesses and too much room for performance. The kind of gathering where men pretended it was business, but everyone knew it was about rank. The enemy wanted Bumpy in a public space where any reaction could be framed as panic. They wanted him to either explode so they could call him unstable, or stay silent so they could call him finished. What they didn't understand was this: Bumpy Johnson's silence wasn't absence, it was control. And by the time the meeting arrived, Harlem had already started choosing which kind of power it wanted to live under. The meeting was held in a place that looked harmless from the street. A narrow doorway, a small sign, warm light behind glass. But inside, it was arranged like a stage chair set to face each other. Table cleared, ashtrays placed like punctuation. Men dressed as if respect could be worn. Too many witnesses, too much space for pride. Too much silence waiting to be used. They wanted Bumpy in the middle of it, not because they needed his agreement, because they needed his agreement. He arrived without hurry, coat neat, hat set right, eyes calm. No announcement. No entourage pushing air out of the room. He walked in like he belonged there because the neighborhood had already decided he did. The room stiffened anyway. Some men stood, Some didn't. The ones who stayed seated weren't brave. They were committed. That's what made it dangerous. A room can be corrected. Commitment is harder. Bumpy took his place with the same quiet care he gave everything. He didn't scan the room like a hunter. He looked like a man attending business that had been settled long before he stepped through the door. Talk started. Numbers. Roots. Small problems dressed up as big ones. The enemy let it go on just long enough to create the feeling of normalcy, then slid the knife in. It wasn't a shout. It was a line delivered with a smile. A remark about Harlem needing new hands. A casual suggestion that certain rules were getting old. A laugh soft, polite, meant to imply Bumpy's authority was a tradition, not a reality. Somebody chuckled too quickly. Somebody else pretended to sip his drink. The room held its breath. Everyone expected violence because violence was the simplest answer, the easiest, the one men used when they couldn't control how they were being seen. That was the trap. Force Bumpy to defend himself like an ordinary man. But Bumpy didn't defend. He let the line sit in the air until it belonged to the man who spoke it. Let the smile become awkward. Let the courage in that voice start dying when it received no response. Silence doesn't just pause a room. Silence judges it. Bumpy looked at the table, not down, but through. He didn't acknowledge the insult. Not with anger. Not with humor. Not even with a warning glance. He treated it like it wasn't worthy of his time. That was worse than confrontation, because now the man who spoke had nowhere to place his challenge, no argument to continue, no reaction to point at. He had exposed himself for nothing, in front of witnesses who would remember every second. Then Bumpy spoke calmly and changed the subject, not because he was avoiding the insult, because he was refusing to share the room with it. He mentioned a delivery schedule, a boundary line, a simple rule about conduct near certain blocks. His tone was even, like he was explaining weather, not authority. And as he spoke, the room began to settle back into him. Men nodded. Some with relief, some with resignation. The enemy realized what was happening too late. Bumpy had turned the stage into a courtroom. The insult had been entered into evidence. Not by repeating it, but by ignoring it so completely that everyone could feel how small it was next to his control. The man tried to recover. He smiled again, weaker now. He added a second remark, hoping to regain the room's attention. But attention had shifted. Harlem wasn't watching the loud mouth anymore. Harlem was watching the man who didn't have to answer. And in that imbalance, loyalty revealed itself, not with speeches, but with posture, with who leaned toward Bumpy's calm and who sat back with their pride. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic exit. Bumpy stood first. Slow, composed. He adjusted his coat like the night had been ordinary. But nobody moved until he did, because they all understood the truth everyone pretends not to say. In Harlem, the strongest man isn't the one who threatens. It's the one who can silence a room without raising his voice. The lesson didn't end when Bumpy walked out. That's what made it unbreakable. Men stayed seated after he left, staring at the table like it had betrayed them. The room felt different, now smaller, colder because Bumpy had taken the air with him. Not through force, through ownership. The man who tried to turn laughter into leverage kept his smile too long. It didn't fit anymore. He looked around for support and found only careful faces. No one wanted to be seen standing too close to a mistake. Not tonight. Not with Harlem listening. That's how Bumpy's power worked. It didn't crush you in front of witnesses. It made witnesses step away from you on their own. It turned your friends into strangers without a single threat. Outside, the neighborhood received the news the way it always did, quietly. Barbers heard it first. A bartender heard it second. A runner heard it third and carried it like scripture without adding one unnecessary word. They didn't say, Bumpy won an argument. They said, the room went dead. They said nobody could breathe right after his name landed. They said the bold ones suddenly started speaking softer, like their own mouths had become dangerous. Within days, the man who spoke out of turn felt his world shrink. Not dramatically. Not in a way that invited police attention. In small, humiliating shifts that only a man in that life could fully understand. A delivery arrived late. A favor got delayed. A favor got delayed. A familiar handshake turned into a distant nod. Places where he used to be welcomed became busy. He tried to correct it by talking louder. That only made it worse, because the more noise he made, the clearer it became that he was chasing something Bumpy already possessed without chasing. Bumpy didn't send a message. He didn't need to. His message was the pattern, the calm continuation of business under his rules while the challengers slowly learned what it meant to stand outside them. And Harlem approved, because Harlem valued order more than excitement. A city like that couldn't live off chaos. It needed stability. It could trust, even if it came from hard hands. Bumpy's strength wasn't that he could hurt men. It was that he could stop men from hurting the neighborhood. By the end of the week, the challenger asked for a private conversation. Not as a demand, as a request. The kind of request that carries the taste of surrender. It was granted. No one knows what was said inside that room. That's the final proof of power. When the correction is so complete, it doesn't need to be public. Harlem only needed to see one thing. That Bumpy Johnson could turn disrespect into discipline and keep the city standing while everyone else learned to speak softer. Harlem didn't keep the insult. It kept the silence. That's how the neighborhood remembered its turning points, by the feeling they left behind, not the noise they made. Men retold the night in barbershops and back halls the way they handled most truths, clean, controlled, with nothing extra. They didn't say, Bumpy shouted anyone down. They said a room full of proud men forgot how to speak. They said laughter died like somebody put a hand over its mouth. Older heads nodded when they heard it, because they understood what restraint meant in a place that could burn fast. Younger ones listened with a different kind of respect, learning that the most dangerous man isn't always the one holding a gun. Sometimes it's the one who doesn't need to. What Harlem needed from Bumpy wasn't spectacle. It was a standard, something firm enough to keep reckless men from turning the streets into their own battlefield. People had families, jobs, church clothes hanging in closets, children growing into their names. The neighborhood couldn't afford pride-driven war, so the story became a lesson that traveled quietly. If you wanted power in Harlem, you didn't buy it with noise. You didn't prove it by embarrassing men in public. You didn't drag trouble onto blocks where decent people lived. You earned it by keeping order when everyone else wanted drama. Bumpy's legacy lived in that rule. Not in headlines, not in threats, in the way corners stayed calmer after the message spread, in the way disputes lowered their voices, in the way men understood that disrespect didn't always get answered with blood. Sometimes it got answered with removal, with isolation, with the slow closing of doors. And the city kept moving. That was the unbreakable part. Harlem survived another week without tearing itself apart because one man refused to rush consequence. Years later, when someone tried to test the neighborhood the same way, somebody always said it softly, like a warning that didn't need volume. Bumpy Johnson. And the room would change shape again, because Harlem didn't just remember his name. Harlem remembered what his silence meant.